What are the types of plastic that you can print with a 3D printer? Well, I've got three of the most common ones here. There are hundreds of different types of plastics that can be printed with a 3D printer. For the most part, about 99% of the time, you're only going to need a few of them. So for starters, let's go with the most common and the easiest to print, PLA. PLA, or polylactic acid, is a bioplastic based on starches made from cornstarch or sugarcane starch usually. It's pretty cheap. You usually find it $20 a kilogram. It is great for most of the printing you're going to do. Now, to print it, you'll need a hotting temperature of around 200 degrees Celsius, and a heat bed is optional, although it is helpful to have one. And the heat bed should be about 50 to 60 degrees Celsius. All the temperatures I'll be saying here are in Celsius. It's just how 3D printing is. Everything's in Celsius. It comes out with some pretty solid looking parts, and they can hold up pretty well to a little bit of abuse. They are a little bit stiff and brittle, so if something's being taking a lot of shock loads, it will crack and it will break. It also can't hold up to very hot temperatures. It starts to deform around 60 degrees Celsius, and sometimes will start to deform if you leave it in a hot car even. So you don't want to be careful and not to leave it out in the heat because it will deform. It's also not UV resistant, so out in the sun it will start to deform and get discolored. If your PLA parts are breaking, you want something a little stronger, you can upgrade to PETG. Bear with me in this. This is a long word, but polyethylene terephthalate glycol. PET is a very common plastic, and the glycol additive makes it a little bit easier to 3D print. So this is a slightly more flexible and tougher plastic than PLA. It does take a little bit higher temperatures to print, and is a little bit trickier to print too. So for the temperatures, you'll need a 250-degree hot end and a bed temperature of usually 85 to 100 degrees. Now, another cool thing about PETG is it comes in clears and transparents. So if you want something see-through, PET or PETG is your best bet. Outside of 3D printing, you'll commonly find it used in plastic water bottles, things like that. So it's a pretty useful plastic, especially if you need something that's going to be a little bit stronger. The last plastic I have here on the table is TPU. Now, TPU is super cool. Thermoplastic polyurethane is its long name. It is a variant of TPE filament, or thermoplastic elastomer, and what it is basically printable rubber. So this is a little benchy I made from TPU, and if you look, I can squeeze it and it flexes. Now, this is super useful for things like custom intake wheels. One year on 8417, we used it to print some custom intake spokes that would reach out and grab it. Where they were flexible, it would bend around the elements. It's also a little bit sticky because it is kind of rubbery, so it'll help grip onto it. But this stuff is great also if you need something that's going to be super shock resistant. Because it is flexible, it's never going to crack. It can just take a beating. Now, the disadvantages to this is you need a direct drive extruder. Because the film is so flexible, a Bowden style, where it has a tube that separates the extruder from the hot end, you just can't push it through. It'll just flex and not go through the nozzle. You also need about a 210, 220 degree hot end, and heat bed isn't required, but I find it so much easier to print with a heat bed. Around 50 to 60 degrees. Similar temperatures to PLA, just a little bit higher. The other thing that this film is tricky with is it likes to string. If you look closely, I don't know how closely you can see, but there's a bunch of little strings in there, and that comes from it just being so flexible. It's hard for the extruder to get the extraction right and pushing it through, so it tends to ooze a little bit more. It's a little bit trickier to print and make look nice. Outside of 3D printing, TPU is most commonly found in skateboard wheels. That's probably where you'll know it best from. The next filament I'm going to go over is one I don't recommend using, but it is very widely available and I think it's worth talking about. It's ABS, or acrylonitrile butadiene styrene. I probably mispronounced that, but is one of the most popular plastic used worldwide, especially in injection molding. And in the early days of 3D printing was the main one used. In recent years, it's mostly been replaced by PLA and PETG because they have most of its strengths without its major cons. And the biggest one of those is its smelly and toxic fumes. When you print it, when you heat it up to those high temperatures, it releases styrene fumes. So you need a closed printer with a ventilator system in order to print it safely. and it requires about 210, 240 degrees Celsius on the hot end, and a heat bed of about 85 to 100 degrees. So similar temperatures to PETG, little less on the hot end, but similar heat bed. It also has a big warping problem. So if you're trying to print it without an enclosure in just a well ventilated room, you still might run into problems with some warping. It's just all in all a tricky filament to print, and PETG is a much better option in my opinion. Another type of filament that's kind of on the up and coming is ASA, is a variant of ABS that is designed mostly for outdoor uses, so it's very UV resistant. Is a little bit easier to print than ABS. It's still in the styrene family, so it still releases those styrene fumes, so you'll need an enclosure. Outside of 3D printing, ABS and ASA are most commonly found in Lego. They are injection molded out of ABS. Those are kind of the main filaments you'll see. There are a bunch of other types, and I'll hit on a few of those briefly. If you want to learn more, there'll be a bunch of links to some articles about them if you want to read about them. Some of them are really cool. For example, PVA or PVB, Polyvinyl Alcohol or Polyvinyl Butyral are some super cool filaments if you have a multiple extruder or multiple material printer. They are dissolvable support material. So if you have a complex print that requires supports, because 3D printers can't print on nothing, they have to print on something underneath. If you have overhangs, you need something supporting it. And PVA and PVB are super cool because they are dissolvable. So if you print your supports out of them and your model out of something else like PLA or PETG, you can stick it in water or isopropyl alcohol, depending on which one you get, and it will just dissolve away, so you don't have to worry about picking away all the supports. The next filament is nylon. It's a slightly flexible but extremely tough filament. If you need something even stronger than PETG, nylon's where you want to go. However, you do want to be careful. It is a very, very tricky filament to print, and it is extremely hygroscopic, meaning it absorbs moisture in the air, and when it does that, it makes it no longer printable, and you need to dry it out somehow. There are ways to do this, but in order to store it and print it properly, you need to have it in a dry box of some kind. If you can get it to print well, they will be super strong parts. It's a very cool filament. Most commonly outside of 3D printing, you'll know nylon as what zip ties are made of, to give you an idea of its strength. The next one I'll go over is polycarbonate. Polycarbonate is a very clear plastic. The brand name for polycarbonate would be lexan. It is often used in bulletproof glass and thick sheets, so it's a very tough filament. However, it does require crazy high temperatures. You need at least 300 degrees on the nozzle and 150 on the heat bed in order to print it. You also need an enclosure, and again, it's incredibly hygroscopic. You need a dry box. Next filaments are the filled varieties. So there are a bunch of varieties of filaments. They come in all sorts of base plastics and fillings. The most common of which, of course, is PLA. You can get PLA filled with rocks. If you want a cool marble effect, you can get it filled with carbon fiber and nylon and metal and some glow-in-the-dark additives. All sorts of stuff. Now, all these filled varieties are going to be abrasive to your nozzles. So you'll want to upgrade to a steel nozzle or a ruby nozzle in order to print them. If you can get them to print, you can get some pretty cool results. Some varieties of filled filaments are stronger than others. Some just have cool looks, like the rock-filled ones. They give you kind of a marble finish, which looks super cool, but it doesn't really get you any mechanical properties over just regular PLA. The last filaments I want to touch on are the engineering filaments. These are the super cool ones that are kind of crazy. So a kilogram roll, which is what this is, costs up to $500. But with that, you get some crazy strong parts. Peak and PEC filaments print at 4 to 450 degrees. They produce parts that are as strong as steel by volume while being 80% lighter. These filaments are often used in medical settings where you need sterilized things because they are tough enough to withstand the heat of an autoclave and UV baths. There's links to some articles on these that you can read more about them linked below. And that's all I've got for today. If you have any questions, feel free to ask.